So today we have a presentation by Rory du Plessis, Are They Human or Are They Data? Digital Archives and the Creation of Humanizing Stories. So Dr. Rory du Plessis is a senior lecturer in visual culture studies at the School of Arts at the University of Pretoria. He is the co-editor of the academic journal Image and Text, and he's also the author of Pathways of Patients in Grahamstown Lunatic Asylum, 1890 to 1907. And I think he's going to talk about that now as well. He has pioneered the investigation of photographic records from South African psychiatric facilities as a resource to humanize the subjects who were institutionalized in the late 19th and early 20th century. Rory, I'll stop my share now, and then you can take over.
Thank you, Menno.
Let's quickly see if we can get that sharing to work.
Check and see.
I can currently see your screen. Yep, there we go. This all looks good. Now, Rory, the virtual floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Menno, and thank you, audience or virtual comrades. I'm honored to present before all of you, and thank you especially to Menno for inviting me to present my research, which I am passionate about. And I think I do also have a pathology of that. After so many years of working with these records, I still love them. And I hope some of the sentiment of my love for this material will come across in the presentation. So I am quite passionate, and that's my disclaimer, because I presented or the information not as data, but as human subjects, and for us to recognize our responsibility, even though we may be working as in the digital realm, we have a responsibility to real bodies, to real people. And that's my emphasis, is not necessarily that we can do everything at once, but we should partner with individuals who can make these digital archives become human archives. So this is not necessarily preaching to the choir, but it is an opportunity for us to think beyond the digital, that our journey does not just end with the digitizing of archives, but should also work with collaboration and to work with research partners to make the digital human and to humanize it. So to start off with, I want to introduce you to the Wellcome collection, based in the United Kingdom. And what's phenomenal about the Wellcome collection is that they've actually digitized most of their records pertaining to the United Kingdom, Great Britain's history of mental health as well as medical health collections. So it is actually the leading digital archive of global medicine, health, and healing in the international community at the moment. And their aim at the Wellcome is to challenge how we think and feel about health. And I emphasize this is their aim, to challenge how we think and feel about health. So the Wellcome collection works as a digital archive, and it also has multiple other projects attached to it that allow us to think about how it challenges the way we think about health. But I'm in particular just interested in looking at what happens when we digitize sensitive material. So what we see here are 3 patients, lunatic patients from the 19th century, who were institutionalized in a wide variety of 19th century lunatic asylums, or what we would refer to as psychiatric institutions. And this is part of their archive. And the archive, in this sense, acts as a container or a context for the images. It anchors images and provides interpretation. But if something is available, this digital archive of these patients is available on the internet, they can also be searched via Google searches outside of the archive. So what I'm interested in is that although the Wellcome speaks about aiming to establish and to create histories of mental health and wellness and well-being, is this possible if most viewers to such archives would see it via the internet, where you search on a Google platform, let's say, images of madness, and these images of these individuals pop up. But what does it mean to see these individuals as mad people versus seeing them as people? If this image is presented in a Google search in images or pictures, and you see this picture alone, what we see is not necessarily madness, we see our prejudice. Because this image is coded already with the sense of madness, we would look at the image on the left of the lady where it's called chronic mania and start to, I see that she's mad. I see that she looks different. I see that she may look with her eyes and her teeth and her disheveled hair. What about the individual in the middle or the image on the right-hand side? We slowly start to recognize and we see. But what I would like us to acknowledge is that we don't necessarily see madness. There's no truth in this image. We see our prejudice reflected back to us, that we see what we want to see with madness, and that madness is informed by stereotypes that we've come to understand from popular culture. What we also don't see is that these people in front of us were actually people first. They were not necessarily mad. They weren't born mad. Maybe they became mad, and maybe this image of chronic mania on our left-hand side was an individual who fell ill for a period of time and thereafter was recovered. But we're not necessarily aware of the story. And I'm interested in the story. That do we see these as subjects of data to indicate the iconography and the visualization of madness? Or do we slowly start to reckon that and pull that rein back in a bit and say, maybe we should see more? And the digital archive must allow us, like as a form of deep mapping or embedded with hyperlinks, that it encourages us to see more, that we can't just see an image of madness, because in a sense it's complicit within stereotypes of madness. What we should start to see is to see more. The image needs to be embedded in a context. It needs to be embedded in a broader horizon. So what Diamond, the first photographer of madness, said in 1856, and why these photographs were taken, is that Diamond, a psychiatrist of the time, said that a photograph is very important, because once it's presented to an observer, they would be able to listen to how the picture speaks for itself of the sitter's mental suffering. So these images were taken as part of Diamond's project to visualize madness. And as he said, there's no need for any context based on these images, because the image speaks louder than any context required, because we all see madness. And what I'm trying to consider is how, if this was the context of these images being created in this sense, how should we think of it differently about digital archiving, where we don't re-perpetuate these stereotypes of the conception of these images, but we consider these subject first, people first, stories first, not data, because the data is inherently flawed. These are not pictures of madness. This is a picture of one state of madness that the person may have been depicted in. And we should also be very aware of the posing that took place, how the individuals were portrayed, and the whole photographic dimension of that. For a photograph to take place, what would take place, or what needs to take place, is the sense of there's the subject, there's the photographer, there's the doctor, and there's also the sense of the dressing, the mise-en-scene. All of these are factors which come into play, but we're not aware of that if we are just an unlearned audience engaging with images of madness, and these images perpetuate the stereotype rather than challenging. We also need to see that some of these images are also quite sensitive, and I would ask, to which value would we need to see these images? In visual culture studies, we also need to recognize that when something is seen, something cannot be unseen. And do we wound the individual by perpetuating them in an image that they don't want to be seen as? Or what is my value? What is my role in seeing an image of an individual who's been amputated, held into place for a photograph, and labeled as mad? I'm concerned about that, but also very concerned that an image locks into eternity, locks into for eternity, for all prosperity of an image of a subject that is outside of their choosing? Do we acknowledge that this individual wanted to be posed? Do we see consent? But also at the very same time, are we conscious enough to realize that there was a picture taken before of maybe the individual as a child with legs, maybe an adult? Do we see a picture before, after, of maybe the person discharged? But what we see locked in for all eternity is this image which cannot be unseen. And it is with these images that I call for us to say, do we see the human, or do we see a victim? Or do we see a sufferer, a disease, or a condition? If we see a human, we have to see with empathy. We have to see with feeling, affect, emotion, and oneness. And so what I'm trying to call for is the sense that when we look at digital archives, and I'll get to our digitized archives of asylum populations, how do we engage and politicize this pixel that we don't see madness, a condition, a suffering, but we see person first? And that means that it's not sufficient just to digitize, to make it accessible for a wider audience. We need to actually be conscious about how we engage with digitization as one step, and in collaboration with other research projects to engage with artistic dimensions and to work within the arts to embed new hyperlinks and to encourage other ways of seeing, that we don't just see via a Google search image of madness, of suffering, but we see person first. So it's with these images of this individual in particular that I are written into my consciousness. And I try and write in my response, and my research is all to try and say, how would I picture the person as a human subject, not as a condition? We also need to understand that most people on internet search engines would look for madness, and it's not necessarily to equip themselves with a better understanding. We need to understand that audiences may have a morbid curiosity to gawk at mad people. There's a scandal to it. There's an excitement to such projects. They may also seek out salacious stories of abject anguish and travails of torture, sounding like a horror film. And we may also be voyeurs to sensationalism. And this is the context that I'm trying to seek to mediate, to try and prevent that when we search for images of madness, how do we prevent these images? How do we prevent this from being the coding that takes place, that the images we present in digital archives lead to sensationalism, gawking at mad people, and using for purposes that are not necessarily for educational purposes, as we see with the welcome, they aim to educate. But is this possible with such images? Viewing can too easily become pornographic, as the aesthetic qualities of cruelty become an allure in themselves. In a sense, we look at these images because we want to enjoy, we find something exciting about watching suffering. An example of how an image is embedded at the welcome is as you see, the image is Mary Cayley, a patient of the West Riding Lunatic Asylum, Wakefield, Yorkshire, photograph attitude to James Crichton Brown, 1873. And that's the only information we have with her. In the coding, we also see that the images are we can look at visually similar images. And if the welcome is coded in such a way, if the website is presented in this manner, it presents images linked to other images. It presents images similar to one another, but that may look at formalistic or iconographic collections or similarities. But what about seeing the person? And maybe it's not about visually similar images. It's about the uniqueness of this image, the uniqueness of the person. So it's not about seeing the data and having AI generate how this image looks like other images of madness, but it should rather be about us trying to activate the politics of this image, to see in archives that we can't just digitize, we also need to think about the person. And as you see in the screenshot or in the presentation, we use machine learning to find images in our collection with similar shapes and features. And this is, I use this as a dig against the welcome to say, should we not use not AI, but should we rather find and do crowdfunding or crowd research where we slowly start to get humans to engage with these images and to explore about effect and how they look and how they feel, how it would feel for an individual diagnosed with a mental illness in the 21st century to look at this image and to feel with effect and to ask and inquire about that story. So I would rather say in these digitized projects, we need to start thinking differently, start looking at not just using AI to code images as being visually similar and representing stereotypes of madness, but what we should be thinking about is seeing person first. Because again, if the welcome is about educating individuals, this is not necessarily educating. And there's certain politics involved in this. We also need to see that when we look at images from the welcome, already in the back of our eyes, in our mind, we're already looking at these images from our exposure to popular media, where we see images of medical abuse, the supernatural, criminal insanity, and the scary other. So when we look at these images of madness, we're already looking at them from our perspectives of popular media. They've already been informed by our prejudice. They're already informed by all of our back end that tells us how to look at images and how it confirms certain suspicions we have. And again, if this is what is happening, what is our role in educating, in creating digital archives that can move away from perpetuating images and visualizations of madness and looking not at data, but at the person? One of the shocking factors happens to be Bioshock. And why I speak so passionately about madness is we've already seen the consequences of the Wellcome collection. The Wellcome had a collection of individuals who also suffered physical deformities and sufferings from World War I. So in the center, we see an individual who was a World War I veteran. What happened is after a terrible accident on the war front, his face was disfigured and he had to wear a mask. And this is the image recorded in the welcome, the image on the left-hand side, not the middle image. And yes, this could be used for some medical purposes to speak about what happened with face masks and how far we've progressed. But again, if it's just a pixel on the internet, do we really see the image on the left as a person, or do we see them as a shock, as a gruesome horror? What I'm interested in is that the image on the left was used as source material to create the characterization of Bioshock, which is a computer game where they used realistic artworks and musical scores relied on found images and sound, including a recording of a distressed breathing from a physician's website and a digitized First World War medical photograph of soldiers with facial injuries. The use of medical records as source material was intended to enhance the game's realism and hence its potential to frighten and unsettle. So we've already seen that the source material of the welcome can be used to perpetuate, in a sense, it's a vicious circle of when we look at images of madness and suffering, we're already informed by what Hollywood and popular culture says, and that then popular culture can make use of these images from the welcome to perpetuate certain stereotypes. What would happen if this happens to be used for images from the welcome to discuss or to present a film about madness, or that some of the images of the patients are used in the next Hollywood's sequel to The Hills Have Eyes or to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Are we perpetuating stereotypes, or are we using these images for research purposes and to educate the public and to uplift our consciousness to how we engage with these images? So Paulo Virilio, a famous philosopher who I quote ad nauseum, speaks about that ethics always comes after the disaster, We've already seen with Bioshock that images from the welcome can be used for images and for characterizations in Bioshock and for horrendous perpetuations of shock and horror and gruesome pornographic images. What is in our role then if we digitize these archives? How do we anchor to see a human subject, not a pixel, not a found object and not a fiction, but an individual who suffered immensely, who maybe also had kin and identity? How, in a sense, do we see the individual in the middle first? The individual who had a pipe, the individual who had dreams, the individual who had a future. And how do we reconcile it with the image on the left and the right? And how do we engage with viewers to see, if you see the image on the left-hand side, it should be embedded with the image on the right, that you have to see them together. They cannot be untied, they are coded together, that we cannot just look at shock and horror and gruesomeness and engage with it as this pornographic sensationalism, but rather engage with the person first and maybe look at the individual in the middle and see that individual as having worth, and that story to tell has worth, rather than the pixel we see on the left, the pixel that ties an individual to this gruesome horror that becomes sensational. So our digitized archives, at this point in time, our digitized archives consist of the Grahamstown Lunatic Asylum. In order to understand the asylum, we need to understand how the history of the asylum, as well as the context of Thomas Duncan Greenlees, the first medical superintendent. So photographs were taken of our patients. And again, I see this as my responsibility to these individuals. I don't see them as patients, and I worry what happens to these faces. What happens if the digital archive, it's been digitized, but what happens if it becomes live? What do we do with these images? What stories would the pixel tell in the end? How would it be appropriated by popular culture? How do I make sure that when people see these images, they see the person first, rather than the context? Because the context of why these images were taken was that Greenlees took these pictures of these patients, and why they, in a sense, their picture was taken, not because they were a person, but because they were institutionalized at the asylum, and being institutionalized meant that you had a casebook opened, a double folio spread, and a photograph was taken for you to, for the doctor to know who the patient was. They were photographed and institutionalized because they were seen as monstrosities. At the time, in 1890, when the photos took place, like you see on the left-hand side, October 30, 1890 was when the photo was taken of the individual on our left. And they were institutionalized because they were seen as monstrosities, as an awful curse, and that the least amount of money should be given to these individuals who were seen to taint the breeding population of the country, and were seen to be if I quote from my notes, Greenlees propagated a dehumanized account of the patients. He described them as an awful curse and an army of deformed creatures, and the most hopeless and helpless of stray waifs of humanity. He presented them to live an unfulfilled existence fraught with incessant suffering and day-to-day struggles. Ultimately, Greenlees motioned for the government to sanction their extermination and sterilization, to prevent them from populating the world with monstrosities. So this is the purpose why the photograph was taken. It wasn't of the individual's choosing. They were labeled a monstrosity and therefore locked up in the asylum to prevent them from breeding with other individuals and perpetuating a curse of madness. So they've already suffered mass suffering from being institutionalized, besides for the mental suffering. And now how would we look at these images and not perpetuate that suffering and not re-victimize them, in the sense by seeing them, their suffering, but seeing them as a person first? These individuals here as well, they were labeled a curse. I want to label them as a person and see them as a person first. And the data, if we look at the case books, the data is already aligned to us seeing them. The data, the casebook entries all speak about them being incapable, incompetent. So what do we do with this data set? Because if we work in digital humanities, we think about data first. We think about what story the data can tell. But if the story is all about perpetuating them as monstrosities, if the doctor speaks about how useless and what a waste of money and expenses they are in the asylum, what do we do with this data? How do we engage? What do we count? And what do we see as worthy of counting? What I want us to try and engage with is that how do we responsibly face up to these images without reenacting the dehumanization of the sitter? How do we narrate stories of abuse, suffering, and cruelty that enforces the stereotypes of patients as meat victims? How do we prevent this from happening? How do we make sure that we're not complicit in the legacies of vulnerability and unequal power relations? So if these images were all taken because of these bases, or of this basis, of that they were dehumanized, they are stories of abuse, suffering, and cruelty, and that there was a sense of vulnerability and power relations because they were mute patients towards a doctor. How do we prevent these three stories from taking place in our engagement with these individuals? Paul Ricoeur has argued, as soon as the idea of a debt to the dead, to people of flesh and blood, to whom something really happened in the past, stops giving documentary research its highest end, history loses meaning. Again, if we're just capturing this to create an archive, are we necessarily satisfying a debt to the dead? We're digitizing and creating pixels. But what about if we had a responsibility to the dead, that we no longer frame them in terms of suffering as monstrosities? But how would we engage with the past as a remedy to create a sense of social justice? So our ethical duty then must be, and we need to encompass questions of where does it go? Where does this image go? And what is the purpose? Where, if we had to trace where this image of madness goes, what purpose, what use, what story will it tell? And these are some of our ethical responsibilities we need to engage with working with digital archives, is to say our ethical duty is a debt to the dead on one side, not to data, but a debt to the dead. And on the other side, what do we do with where does this image go? How do we ensure that it does not necessarily perpetuate some right-wing agenda or the rise of eugenics or the importance of speaking about sterilization? And these are not just hypothetical questions. If we think in 2015 and 2016, we had the life Isidimini crisis where over 140 individuals were killed off as an act of genocide by the South African state. Also, we have 1,900 extra patients who suffered immense suffering, dehydration, starvation, and they were just lucky enough not to die. But is that lucky enough not to die if you've already engaged with all of that suffering and you face those sufferings still today? That the Life Isidimini struggle was only brought to the attention of the public because 144 people died. But yet it still continues today with people suffering from morbid sense and abject forms of abuse. And what happens to these images we produce? Is it there to continue these stories, or do we create images to create an injuncture against our present and our past? And in that sense, I refer back to an image that happened with Kevin Partner's Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph taken in 1993 of a starving Sudanese child with a vulture waiting in the background. And I use this to create a sense of moral impetus in looking at images. That what happened in this image is when people looked at the suffering of the child, their first question was to say to Kevin, did you chase away the vulture? So it wasn't the photographer's responsibility any longer just to take a photograph of suffering, but there was a moral injunction upon the photographer to say, did you stop there? Did you intervene? Did you create something? Did you lift up the child? Did you carry the child? Did you feed the child? And so what happened post 1993 with this image is it became a moral impetus in a photographer no longer to be just an outsider, an individual who's a objective witness, but somebody who has to intervene, who cannot just stand back and watch suffering take place. And I would argue that when we create digital archives, we can't just perpetuate suffering. We need to create an intervention at hand to make sure that we don't perpetuate abuse, to label a starving child with a vulture there, and for eternity, this is the pixel, this is the image of the child. We need to repatriate the person to the pixel. So we don't just have a moral responsibility to record or to digitize, to be passive and to observe, but we need to intervene. And digital archives call for an intervention on the part of a larger project scale of maybe conscientizing processes, maybe acts of moralization, acts of research. So what is our intervention, or how do we save in digital humanities? What does it mean to produce material that humanizes rather than continues to dehumanize the subject? What we have seen in the archives is that if we have to just look at, my interest is to say we must produce histories sensitive to the subjects of the past and in solidarity with the subjects of the present. And if we slowly start to think about these objects, our mandate in the digital humanities is less about the digital and more about engaging with humanities. And this is obviously why my emphasis is in working with the School of the Arts, but to focus less on thinking about how to code the data, but to rather work with how do we take this data, which has been digitized, and how do we slowly start to tell other stories, human stories that engage with humanities, rather than just methodologies and skills and tools from the digital. But we must never forget about the importance of us as humans and our scholarship in the humanities. So most digital approaches would look at counting data. So, and we have seen certain projects take place in the Grahamstown Lunatic Asylum where individuals will count population groups and will then look at the data and count from, let's say, physical causes of insanity and look at these examples and say, okay, well, the data speaks of percentage of Black patients who became insane was 13% from intemperance to drink, 4% from sexual self-abuse, masturbation, congenital defect, unknown, privation, starvation, too. And this is some of the raw data. But does this necessarily tell the story? Or does it just tell a percentage? And if the case books are already written from the perspective of a white doctor in the 1890s, based in colonialism and eugenics, are we not counting the wrong facts? And what I'm interested in my work is to say, let's look at certain factors and certain anomalies that Greenlees in the 1890s used the fact that 13% of the Black population, or 13% of physical causes of insanity in the Black patients was based on intemperance to drink, and therefore said that the Black population is unable to survive the civilization to be civilized, because in a sense they are savages, and that with the onset of colonization, they could not cope. They never had the opportunity to engage with alcohol, and therefore this was their downfall. And then eventually they would be in a level of self-extermination because they couldn't cope with civilization. That was the story he presented from these facts. And then therefore it continued in multiple research publications and fulfilled and perpetuated by a whole industry of colonial psychiatry. But what I'm interested in is that a higher percentage is from unknown. And I engaged with that number to say, what is the story of this unknown? Why is unknown the highest? What What is unknown about these individuals? And if you engage with the stories, we start to learn something different. That that sometimes these patients were taken up by the asylum, not necessarily because they were mad, but because of sufferings of the colonial context. So one example is one individual who was diagnosed as unknown, and this is his story. So the doctors described him to be mentally ill. He was then certified insane and sent to the asylum, diagnosed as unknown and part of Dringley's physical causes of insanity. But this is his story. The medical certificates for Solomzi, a 19-year-old laborer from Uitenhage, present the following three aspects as evidence of insanity. He thought that he was 3 weeks old. He wished to buy sweets if given money to spend, and he idly wandered about during the day. Those are the three reasons why he was institutionalized and diagnosed as mad. Once he came to the asylum, 3 weeks after his admission, Dringley's considered him to be recovered, and he examined him for discharge. And I quote here from Dringley's words: "I have held a long conversation with him on frequent occasions, and while I was of the opinion that he was insane on admission, I now certify that while he's not of the brightest intellects, he is no longer insane and requiring asylum treatment. He is quiet, has become industrious in his habits, does not express any delusions, even after much cross-questioning. When I asked him if people went to church to sleep, he said, men who went to church when they were tired with work generally slept during the service. I then asked him what he would do with half a crown if I gave it to him. And he said he would buy something good to eat, as he required nothing else, for example, clothes. He does not know the name of this place, but says his fellow patients all seem mad. I am further of the opinion that the patient is an illiterate native, and many of the delusions expressed by him to the medical man who examined him are simply the result of a lack of education. He is no longer insane." So what I find interesting is that the story, if we do have to count numbers, the story of the unknown speaks of a different realization of who these patients were, that they were actually imprisoned by the colonial doctors of the time for not necessarily following certain standards and certain features. But yet what we find is that the story of the unknown, not the number, but the story tells something completely different. The story speaks of individuals who are highly intelligent, who are coping with civilization, who are able to understand what church refers to. But that is not the story that is told by Dreamies. And that's the story that we need to focus on. It's not the data of that 18, the highest percentages, physical causes of insanity. It happens to be unknown, but rather focus on the story first, not just counting numbers. So one of my approaches that I follow is not just engaging with the archive as data, but also engaging with humanities approaches and artistic avenues where if humanity speaks about storytelling, let's engage with these stories. Let's engage with the stories of these individuals and learn from them, and not just see them as data, but see them as person first. So a personal story is, I'm very much interested in the idea that we need to implicate ourselves in the research, and that we have an ethical scholarship does not necessarily mean refusing to look, but requires us to acknowledge our uneasiness and use of this as a starting point. So I'm interested in that these images are important because these are the only images of imbecility, lunacy, idiocracy, all of images of madness that we have from the 19th century, because those are the only archived images we have. So we need to make use of these images because they have a story to tell. But how do we ensure that their story actually counts? For example, if we look at the public archives at this point in time, and what is perpetuated is only images of queens and kings and nobility and prime ministers. But we don't have a 19th century record of illness, of mental illness. So by including these images from the casebook, we have an opportunity to acknowledge that madness has a past in our country. But how do we make sure that this past, when we digitize it, we don't perpetuate a stereotype of suffering, but we rather engage with the person first and engage with their story and work with the story as an opportunity to learn about ourselves and to learn about our past and where we are in the present. So I held an exhibition to behold in Revere in, I think it was in 2022. And the interest in this was for me to take these images from the archive and that have also now been digitized and to hold them. And there's a pun with a sense of hold. I wanted to hold them dear to me and to present them in a new context and a new story, where if in the original context they were embedded in a casebook that spoke of them as monstrosities, and then when we digitize them, we see them just as a pixel. I wanted to make sure that to change the context and to hold these images up, not as a pixel, not as a monstrosity, but to hold them up as a person and to tell my personal story of working with these images. And I blew up these casebook images, who are the size of a passport photograph, up to an A0. So you would have to step back and look at these images and hold them up in the gallery space, hold them up as portraits, and told intimate stories of their personal lives to the audience and held walkabouts. So what I was trying to indicate is that we can't just digitize. We need to engage with the arts and humanities to really think about how do we change the context? How do we activate in an audience the possibility to see differently and to engage with an audience of individuals? So yeah, you see the photographs presented outside of a clinical context, and I made sure that there was no written text, but I was the narrator of the story, and it became a performative piece where it was me telling the story, a personal story of each of these patients. And in that sense, the project was there to create a space which was reverential, sacred, contemplative, and meditative. And while I am not able to change the past, I am able to maybe think about how we change our present and our future. That we don't think of these individuals no longer held up as monstrosities, that we give them a new future. These pixels or these people have a new future, not labeled to a monstrosity. There's a form of historical justice that takes place, but also to consider our future, of what we do with our present, how we deal with our people with mental illnesses, as well as intellectual disability in the present. How do we engage with their future and their story? And how do we engage with archives then to reflect on the past and the present? And how do we maybe make use of these stories from the past to interrogate the stories of our present and our future? And I will leave it there so that we can open up for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rory. There is a bit of noise outside my room here. I hope it's not too bad. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet. I actually do have a few questions. So I very much like your presentation, and I think what you're doing is you're taking this human aspect, right, from the archive, and I think that works very well. I mean, this is something you really need to think about in this with these kinds of archives. But if you're looking at other types of archives, so personally, I'm working with text, so I've got collections of text. So how does this? I mean, I realize I need to rethink what does all of this mean before I just use text as data. But how does it? But the questions are a bit more difficult, right? So there is no. So the human is kind of hidden behind the text. So how should I go about doing something like this?
I think there's a sense of reflexivity in it, and also an opportunity to realize what I enjoy about the digital humanities is it's a partnership, and it's an opportunity for us to also recognize when our limits end. And maybe it's just a consciousness for you, Menno, to say that this is what I can do, but somebody needs to take it further, or collaborate with an artist, or collaborate with a drama student who takes the text and re-narrates it in a different sketch to activate it, or work in a website format. Or I think it's the sense of collaborating that, as long as we're conscious that we can't just work with data, because the data is actually generated from human subjects. And what does it mean to think differently? I think about the idea of how some people have made use of massive data sets from prison files because prison files are very important, because it captured the inmates' weight as well as their height. And if you look at records from the 19th century, you can then track and compare it to the 20th and 21st centuries and speak about how we've increased in height. And that's one aspect that you can look at the data that was valued. But it feels that the research is fantastic, but it needs another collaborator involved to then speak about the person, to speak about the story, that we don't just mine the person for their biological data, but that we look at the person, and that we recognize that these are prison records, and we need to be sensitive to how this data was created. Do we mine any form of data, even, let's say, weighing prisoners before they were executed to get the best weight for the noose? How do we, when do we think data first, or do we think person first? And I think there's certain moments with, if the work isn't, if your work is text-based and it's not sensitive, I think it's fine to just acknowledge the data part. But once it turns into sensitive records, medical records, there's a moment when, at the archive, I saw the archivist showed me Nelson Mandela's prison records when he was on Robben Island, his medical records. And I had the opportunity to open up in front of me the records of Madiba, the first democratic president of our country, a man who I hold in dear regard. And I thought, this is not my story to tell. This is not the story that needs to be told, is did his eye problems start on Robben Island? And it's that sensitivity when it made me realize, maybe it's not my story to tell, and I'm sensitive to tell it, and maybe I don't look at data first. And it was a decision I made not to open up that record, not even to engage with the voyeuristic, because already at that point I said, I've made up my mind not to open up Madiba's records, not to open up his body, to exhume his body, if we think about it as a political context, to exhume the medical, to exhume the biological. What is that purpose? And unless I know what my purpose is, and the purpose and the goal of this research project, I said, I don't want to. And I, at that point, decided to close the file on the Robben Island prison medical records. And I said, it's not my story. And I need to first grow as a researcher and grow as a person to engage with such sensitivity, because his body matters and his personhood matters. And it was just a consciousness of why I chose not to engage with it. And I think it's just a consciousness in engaging with research to know either when is the data counting more than the person, and to which extent can the person be incorporated in other avenues. Thank you, Matt.
Cool, thank you. I do see there are a few questions in the chat now. We still have a few minutes, so that's really nice. So Niam, I'm not sure exactly if that's your name or an abbreviation, says, this has been really interesting and informative. I just wanted to ask how you went about obtaining and engaging with these records, the legalities around open access, digitization, etc., within a South African context. And also, what platforms are you currently working with in constructing and presenting the archive, the digital archive?
What's interesting is the records, because they're over 100 years old, are freely accessible to anybody. So anybody can go to the Western Cape archives and anybody can open up these records. So there's no access required. You just sign a document to say that if anything is published or you use material, you'll need to cite the Western Cape archives. So it also really allows that if we see that archive, much like the welcome, in the sense that even if it's digitized, it continues with the same story. An archive is maybe not a custodian. No, it's a custodian of material, as it keeps the material, it digitizes it, it preserves it, but it's not necessarily a curator. And that's where I'm interested in is what would mean if we don't just think of ourselves as archivists, as in custodians of the material, but we also become curators of the material, that we care for the human subject in the data. So the information is available for anybody to use for their own purposes. I never made the digital archive. It was part of a biography of the uncharted people run by Stellenbosch University. So that's the digital archives that they created. And I don't quite know what they're doing about it, but if you check and Google a biography of an uncharted people, they've done phenomenal work with prison records, with asylum records, and with birth registers, and tying data, large data samples. So what they've done is, through most of the Cape, they've digitized most of the Western Cape Archives records, as well as some church records that were very private, and then digitized it and worked with large digital sets to try and engage with some stories. And for example, they tied marriage certificates with birth certificates, and they were actually held in two different records. Marriage certificates in the 19th century were tied to the state, but birth certificates were tied to the church. So it was two different data sets. When they tied them together, they realized that the 19th century wasn't the Puritan culture we lived in, but most marriages, about 40% of the population, happened because a birth was imminent. So most 40% of the population in the Cape actually chose to get married because the woman was already pregnant and carrying the child. And therefore they got married, not out of love, but out of making sure that they protected their sense of morality. So those are some fascinating stories. But as I said, my engagement with the archive is not necessarily with the data. And what I would have been more interested in is the sense to say, let's see if we can tie that data, the birth certificate and the marriage certificate, with another story to say, what was the context of the time? What was the story of love? How would those stories be important for us to engage with? And another story that they did do, which was important, was trace the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, and proved that if you looked at the records of where the patients came from, it was tied to the rail stations in the Cape. So that's when data does count, and when counting numbers has value. But I do think that my personal sentiment is now other narratives need to take place. If the records have been digitized, the first tier can be counting where ground zero happened with the Spanish flu in the country. The second take would be to say, now let's hear their stories. What was it like? And the comparison between 1918 Spanish flu with COVID. What was it like to fall ill? What are our stories based on race, class, and gender? Thank you.
Cool, thank you. I see that Susan it's more a comment, I think. So she says, to me, Rory emphasized the importance of context and insisting to give the context of the data also when using, for example, text, which he's using as well. Yeah, I agree. So it's the context. Carolina also has a question. She says, first of all, I'd like to say that I really admire your work in the exhibition To Behold in River. Sounds very impressive. My question is, are there any ethical frameworks or best practices that should guide the digitization and dissemination of records, particularly in the context of medical histories?
Thank you for the comment. Unfortunately, no. And that's where I think I go back to the quote of Paul earlier, ethics comes after the disaster. There's no guidelines. The only guideline sometimes is when it comes to research is that sometimes you should anonymize the patient. But when it's a public record like the Wellcome record, and I encourage anybody to Google the Wellcome record where you can see these images tied to the case books. So 19th century records are being digitized by the Wellcome, and you've got the patient's name, you have their date of birth, you have who they were married to, you have all of this personal information that's available. And the purpose is to say, sometimes there needs to be an ethics to it, that if we work with living subjects, we need to work with disguising identity. But when it comes to these historical subjects who suffered immensely, even in the asylum and with mental illness, in a sense, it's free for all to make use of everything, to trace lineages and genealogies of madness, and to not engage with the person. And that's where I think the research matters. Without a protocol, without ethics, I think the researcher has to adopt that ethical base in their research to say it's not about, it's maybe tying a document as a form of marrying the document of the casebook to maybe their birth certificate, tying that the person had a past, engaging with more material from the archive to not necessarily perpetuate them as a patient, because as I said, there's no guidelines. It's just the Wellcome celebrates that they have the largest digitized archive, and it's celebrated as such, but not necessarily engaged as a political space. And I worry about what will happen to our stories if they ever become online, and who can make use of them, and how do we become both custodians and curators of these digitized subjects, and to focus on their humanity.
Thanks. So this actually, and I realize, and Carolina also says thank you. I realize we're kind of running a little bit over time. Yeah, which I already expected, because this is a very interesting, very interesting topic. So just quickly, one thing, I actually wrote it down as well as one of my questions. So it seems that there's some sort of relationship with the CARE principles, right? So CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And it's normally used in the context of, well, not really this context, but more in the context of indigenous people's rights. Do we need something like this, something more specific? Is there something to work on?
I think it's definitely to work, but because I am I think because I engage with my research very passionately, I think my closing comment would be for the audience participants to engage with their own data so passionately, and to maybe engage with the story, and to engage with their own ethical engagement, because I might be speaking under correction, but I'm also not too aware of any protocols that guide us in working with digital archives and in digitizing, and we don't want a disaster. And I think we're also very concerned that if we think about a few years ago, there was data lies sometimes. Data can reveal something different. Data can reveal racist tendencies, because the data can be tweaked. And my concern then is to say, how do we work with the image stories that we tell, and how do we create a sense of that our protocol becomes part of our methodology, that our understanding of the data as a person derived from a person counts, and how do we create a dialogue about this, that it's not just for an ethics application, but that we actually engage with this as a methodology in engaging with our research and whatever data set. Mena, as you said, you work with text, but what the other participants could work with artworks, or they could work with geographical notes, but how that sensitivity is something that, and that passion is something each of us should embody, because I don't have the answer. And being in the School of the Arts, I'm more artistic and engaging with artistic avenues. But I think it's for each person to step up and to have a dialogue to say, how does the data matter to me, and what is my personal relationship? And as I said, with the story of looking at Madiba's records and choosing to keep the records closed, is the choice to say that that data I can't work with, that data I can't engage with, because I don't know what I'm going to do with it. And I close the book, but the story and the testimony speaks of a methodology. And that's what counts, is what data we choose to count and what we choose to hold up as having value. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think this is really something for all of us to think about. There's some other people saying thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. But I also realized we're running a little bit over time. So I suggest that we stop here, but I'd like to thank you again, Rory, for a wonderful presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Menno. And thank you, audience participants, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share my passion.
Thanks.
Thank you.